My grandfather was the kind of man people described as difficult at his funeral and meant it as a compliment. That was October. The maples along the highway into Sudbury had gone the color of old rust, and there were maybe 30 people in the church, most of them from his curling club, a few from the mill where he'd worked for 40 years. My Uncle Trevor sat in the front row with his arms crossed the entire service, like he was already calculating something. My Aunt Cheryl kept dabbing her eyes with a tissue she never actually needed. My mother, his daughter, was the one who actually cried. I sat beside her and held her hand and tried to remember the last time I'd visited him. It had been 2 summers ago. We'd sat on his back porch drinking Sleeman's, and he'd pointed out a family of loons on the lake and said almost nothing for an hour. At the time I thought it was awkward. Now I understood that was just how he showed you he liked you. His name was Edmund. Wait, no. His name was Gordon Ellery. And when the lawyer called 3 days after the funeral, I was the one who answered because my mother was still barely getting out of bed. The lawyer's name was Whitfield, and he had the flat, patient voice of a man who delivered news like this regularly. He said my grandfather had left the property, all of it, to me. Not to my mother, not to Trevor or Cheryl or their kids, to me. I was 26. I worked in IT support for a property management company in Ottawa. I drove a 2014 Civic with a crack across the passenger side windshield I kept meaning to fix. I was, by most reasonable measures, the last person who should have inherited anything. The property was a fishing cabin about 90 kilometers north of Sudbury on a lake called Lac des Pins. Gordon had built it himself in 1974, before my mother was born. The family had gone there every summer when she was young, but by the time I came along, my grandfather and my Uncle Trevor had had some falling out over something nobody would ever explain to me directly, and the cabin had become Gordon's alone. His retreat, the place he went between November and May every year, ice road and all, living without reliable internet or cell service and apparently being completely fine with that. Trevor called me the day after I spoke to Whitfield. He was not congratulatory. "You know that cabin needs a new roof," he said, "and the dock's been rotting since 2018. There are property taxes owing. You're going to spend more fixing that place up than it's worth." I said I'd figure it out. "You should sell it," he said. "Split it between the family. That's what Dad would have wanted." I didn't say what I was thinking, which was, if that's what Gordon had wanted, he would have written it that way. My mother said nothing when I told her about Trevor's call. She just looked out the kitchen window for a long moment and said, "Your grandfather loved that place more than he loved most people. Take that however you want." I drove up in early November. The highway north of Sudbury narrows and empties out in a way that always catches me off guard, no matter how many times I've done it. The Canadian Shield pushes up through the soil in long gray shelves of rock, and the birch trees go white and skeletal once the leaves fall, and there's a particular kind of silence that starts to settle into the car about an hour out, like the radio loses the signal not just in frequency, but somehow in spirit too. I turned it off somewhere past Chelmsford and just drove. The turnoff for Lac des Pins was a gravel road that my GPS marked as a seasonal route, meaning it existed on the map, but the software wasn't making any promises. I followed it for 11 kilometers, which took about 25 minutes because of the frost heaves, and came out at a clearing above the lake just as the sun was getting low. The cabin was smaller than I remembered. Gray cedar siding, a covered porch, 2 windows facing the water. The dock Trevor mentioned extended about 15 feet out over the lake and sagged visibly on the left side. The roof looked okay to me, but I didn't know enough about roofs to be sure. I had a key. I let myself in. The inside smelled like wood smoke and machine oil and something else I couldn't name. A specific kind of dust that old places accumulate, not unpleasant, almost like paper. There were fishing rods on a rack by the door, a wood stove in the corner with a neat stack of birch beside it, a kitchen table with 2 chairs, a shelf of paperback novels organized by some system I couldn't immediately decode. A single photograph on the wall above the couch, Gordon and a woman I recognized as my grandmother, Eleanor, standing on the dock, probably late 1970s, holding a northern pike between them and grinning. Eleanor had died before I was born. I'd never thought about what that meant for Gordon until that moment. 40 years in this cabin, just him and the lake and whatever he'd found up here that was worth coming back to. I sat down on the couch and for a while I just let the silence do what it does in places like that. I started going through his things the next morning, methodically, the way you have to when you're the one who ends up being responsible. He was tidy. That surprised me, or maybe it didn't. He'd always struck me as a man who knew where everything was. His papers were in a metal filing box under the bed. Insurance documents, the original deed for the property, a logbook where he'd recorded ice thickness on the lake every winter going back to 1989, service receipts for the generator. Everything labeled. Everything dated. I found the municipal tax notice at the bottom of the box. He was 14 months behind. The amount owing, with penalties, was just over $11,000. I sat with that for a while. $11,000. My savings account had about $4,000 in it. My Civic needed new brakes. I had a job, but not a lucrative one. I thought about Trevor's voice on the phone. You're going to spend more fixing that place up than it's worth. Maybe he was right. Maybe I should sell. I stood up and walked around the cabin, trying to see it as a stranger would. Tried to think about square footage and comparable sales in rural northern Ontario and whether the septic was up to code. Tried to be practical. That was when I noticed the floor. Gordon had built this cabin himself, and the floors were wide plank spruce, laid in long boards that had darkened with decades of wood stove heat and foot traffic. I was walking from the bedroom back toward the kitchen when I felt it. A slight variation in the floor's resistance underfoot. Not a creak, more like a softness, a give almost imperceptible that the surrounding boards didn't have. I crouched down and ran my hand along the planks. Two of them, about 3 feet long each, had been cut and relaid. You wouldn't see it unless you were looking. The saw cuts were tight and clean, and the boards had been stained to match. But when I pressed down at the edge, there was a faint movement, and when I got my fingernails under the seam and pulled, the section lifted cleanly, like a panel. Underneath was a steel door, flush with the subfloor, maybe 18 inches square. It had a combination dial set into it, the old kind analog 3 wheels of numbers. I sat back on my heels and stared at it for a long time. I tried combinations that mattered to him. His birth year, 1941. The year the cabin was built, 1974. My grandmother's birthday, which I had to look up on my phone from a photo of an old Christmas card I'd taken years before. Nothing. Then I tried the date on the photograph on the wall. I couldn't be sure it was accurate, but the photo had what looked like a year written in small pencil on the back. 1979. I tried 7979. I tried 1979. I tried combinations of the month and year. I almost gave up. I was about to lower the panel back into place and go make coffee when something made me try Eleanor's birth year instead. 1943. The third wheel clicked. The door opened downward, into a shallow concrete space about the size of a large suitcase. There was a waterproof canvas bag inside, the kind you'd take canoe camping, sealed with a heavy-duty dry bag buckle. I lifted it out. It was dense, heavy for its size. I carried it to the kitchen table and opened it. Inside, wrapped in a layer of oilcloth, were 3 things: a stack of Canadian savings bonds, the old paper kind, the ones they stopped issuing in 2017. Beneath those, a sealed plastic envelope containing what looked like photographs and documents. And at the bottom, a small spiral-bound notebook, the cover water-stained but intact, with my name written on the front in my grandfather's handwriting. For Owen, no, that wasn't right. He would have written my name. For Callum, that was my name. Callum Ellery. I hadn't existed when he built this cabin or buried whatever this was in it. He must have updated it at some point, maybe recently. The ink on the cover was dark and clean compared to the aged paper of the notebook itself. My hands weren't entirely steady when I opened it. The first page said, "If you're reading this, I imagine I've left you with more questions than money. I'm sorry about one of those things. I had to set it down for a moment." He wrote the way he talked, economically, without decoration. Over the next 12 pages, he explained, in the particular shorthand of a man who distrusted sentimentality, what the savings bonds were and roughly what they were worth, and that he'd been setting them aside for 30 years against a situation where the property taxes couldn't be paid and the cabin might be at risk. He'd never trusted banks entirely. The mill had done a pension clawback in 1994 that he'd apparently never fully gotten past, so he'd kept the bonds in the floor, $83,000 in savings bonds. The current value, with accrued interest, would be considerably more. He'd included a note about how to redeem them through the Bank of Canada. But that wasn't what made my throat close up. The sealed plastic envelope contained photographs, black and white, mostly. Gordon and Eleanor, young, in a way I'd never seen him, laughing at something off camera. The two of them at what looked like a summer fair somewhere, her in a sundress, him in a short-sleeved plaid shirt, squinting into the sun. A photograph of a baby I eventually recognized, from the handwriting on the back, as my mother. And beneath the photographs, a letter, 3 pages, handwritten, addressed to my mother by name, Maureen, but never sent. I won't tell you everything the letter said. Some of it wasn't mine to know, and I made myself stop reading halfway through. But the part I read was about the falling out with Trevor, about a business deal, a parcel of land near Timmins that Trevor had wanted Gordon to invest in with him in the early 2000s. Gordon had said no. Trevor had accused him of not trusting him. Gordon had said that wasn't it, that the deal looked wrong to him, that something about the other parties involved didn't sit right. He'd been correct. The deal had collapsed badly 18 months later, taking several families with it. Trevor had lost money. Other people had lost more. There had apparently been some legal proceedings, Gordon mentioned only obliquely. Trevor had blamed Gordon for not saving him from it, for not warning him clearly enough, for not being the kind of father who stepped in, and Gordon, in the letter, wrote, "I tried to tell him, Maureen. He knows I tried. But some people would rather be angry than right, and I've learned I can't fix that in him." He hadn't sent the letter because he didn't want to put my mother in the middle of it. He'd just kept it. Put it in the floor with the bonds and the photographs and the notebook. Left it there. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. The lake was visible through the window, flat and pewter gray in the November light. The opposite shore, a dark line of spruce. Somewhere out there a raven was calling. The savings bonds alone would more than cover the back taxes. There would be enough left over to repair the dock. Probably the roof. Maybe the generator, which I'd noticed was an older model that required more maintenance than it should. I thought about calling Trevor, telling him what I'd found. Part of me wanted to. The petty part. Maybe. Or maybe just the part that hated incomplete stories. I didn't. Instead, I called my mother. She picked up on the second ring, and when I told her I'd found something in the cabin, she was quiet in the particular way she gets when she's bracing herself. I told her about the floor, the door, the canvas bag. I told her about the bonds and that the property taxes would be covered. I heard her exhale. "He always said he'd put money away," she said. "I thought he was just saying it. The way he'd say things without explaining them." "There are letters too," I said. "And photographs. One's of you when you were small, and one of him and Eleanor at what looks like, I don't know, a midway. She's wearing a yellow dress." She made a sound I hadn't heard from her in years, not crying exactly. Something before crying. "He kept that photo," she said. "I didn't know he still had it." I didn't mention the unsent letter. I decided that was a conversation for when I could sit down with her in person, in the cabin, at that kitchen table, maybe in spring when the lake came back. The savings bonds took about 6 weeks to redeem through the federal process. And yes, it was bureaucratic and slow in the specific way that Canada Revenue Agency adjacent processes always are, but the funds cleared in January. The taxes were paid in full. The penalty was negotiated down slightly, with a letter from Whitfield explaining the estate circumstances. Gordon would have appreciated that detail. I drove back up to the cabin in February, which was inadvisable and also perfect. The lake was frozen solid. I checked the ice thickness with a spud bar, the way Gordon's logbook had taught me. and the snow had come up over the porch steps. I spent a long weekend there alone. Cutting and stacking wood. Gordon had already split and left under a tarp, reading his paperbacks by the wood stove, and sleeping better than I had in months. I found more things. Gradually, the way you do when a place becomes yours through use rather than paperwork. A hand-drawn map of the lake folded into the back of one of the fishing guidebooks, with depth markings and spots labeled in his handwriting. A tackle box with a compartment containing a folded-up newspaper clipping from 2003, a small article about the Timmins land deal and its collapse. He'd underlined a single sentence and written nothing else beside it. A jar on the highest kitchen shelf labeled Good Jam, 2021 in his handwriting, which turned out to be a jar of crabapple jelly that was genuinely excellent. Trevor texted me in March. I hadn't told him about the bonds. He asked, in that offhand way of his that wasn't offhand at all, whether I'd given any more thought to selling. I wrote back that I wasn't planning to sell, that I was going to keep the place. He didn't respond. My mother came up in late May, when the ice had gone out and the loons had returned, and the porch was warm enough in the afternoons to sit without a jacket. We drank tea and watched the water, and she told me things about Gordon that I hadn't known, about his years at the mill, about how he'd proposed to Eleanor at a curling rink in Sault Ste. Marie, about how he used to drive 4 hours to pick my mother up from university at the end of every semester without being asked. She read the letter. She sat at the kitchen table with it for a long time, and I walked down to the dock and gave her the space. When she came out onto the porch afterward, she didn't say much. She looked at the lake. She said, "He never stopped caring what happened to people. He just didn't know how to say it out loud." I thought about the jar of crabapple jelly on the shelf, the logbook with 40 years of ice thickness records, the savings bonds in the dark under the floor, the photograph of Eleanor in the yellow dress. Some people leave you everything and you don't know it until after they're gone. The dock got repaired in July. I hired a guy from town who'd done work on half the properties along this stretch of lake, and we replaced the rotting outer section and resealed the whole thing. It cost $2,200, and it's solid now. Gordon would have looked at it and said nothing, which was how he expressed satisfaction. I'm up here most weekends now, when the drive from Ottawa isn't brutal. I've started keeping my own logbook. Not ice thickness, I'm not out here in December, not yet, but small things. First loon call of the season, day the ice went out, that kind of thing. I still think about what Trevor said. You're going to spend more fixing that place up than it's worth. He wasn't wrong about the math, maybe. But I've been thinking about value differently since that November afternoon, when I lifted up a section of spruce floor and found 30 years of my grandfather's quiet, stubborn love sitting there in a canvas bag, waiting for someone who needed it. He didn't outsmart anyone. He didn't take down a criminal network or expose a conspiracy. He was just a man from Sudbury who worked in a mill for 40 years and loved a lake and never quite figured out how to tell the people he loved that he loved them. So he found other ways. I think about that a lot, actually. Whether I'm doing the same thing, whether the people I care about know it, or whether I'm making them wait until after I'm gone to figure it out. There's still a question I ask myself every time I drive up that gravel road and come out above the lake and see the cabin sitting there in the trees. If I'd never looked at the floor that afternoon, would I have sold the place? I don't know. Maybe. I'm glad I looked.